I found the letter at 6:52 in the morning, still in my robe, looking for the car insurance renewal notice in the drawer of the hallway table. It wasn't a receipt this time. It wasn't a text message I saw upside down on his phone. It was a handwritten letter, 2 pages, folded into thirds, tucked beneath a stack of takeout menus, and it was addressed to my husband in my mother-in-law's handwriting. That same handwriting I had seen on birthday cards for 9 years. The same looping cursive she used to sign Christmas tags with love, always Diane. I stood in the hallway of our house in Naperville, Illinois, in my bare feet on the cold hardwood, and I read every single word. My hands were completely still. My breathing was steady. When I finished, I folded the letter exactly as I had found it, replaced it under the takeout menus, and went to make coffee. I was 41 years old. I had been married for 9 years. And from that Tuesday morning in February, everything I did was preparation. The letter was not about an affair, at least not in the way people usually mean when they say that word. It was Diane writing to her son, my husband Marcus, telling him that I had been, as she put it, difficult to manage, that I was too independent, that I kept my own finances separate from his, and that this was a sign of a woman who doesn't truly commit. She wrote that she had spoken to her financial advisor, a man named Gerald, who I had met at Diane's holiday party, and who had always looked at me with barely disguised contempt, and that Gerald believed I was protecting assets in anticipation of leaving. She told Marcus he needed to find a way to consolidate our finances before I could take what isn't hers. She signed it. "You deserve a woman who is all in, Marcus. You always have. I love you." I set the mug down on the kitchen counter and I thought, how long has she believed this? How long has she been working toward it? And then I thought the more important question, how long has he been listening? My name is Claire Hutchins. Claire before Marcus, Claire after, and Claire every day in between, whether he remembered that or not. I am 41 years old, and at the time I found that letter, I was a licensed forensic accountant with 16 years of professional experience, a master's degree from the University of Illinois, and a client list that included 4 mid-sized corporations and a family of regional restaurant chains. I knew how money moved. I knew how it hid. I knew what paper trails looked like when someone had tried to erase them and failed. This is not a story about a woman who didn't see it coming. This is a story about a woman who saw every single thing coming, documented all of it, and waited until she had exactly what she needed. Marcus Hutchins was 44 years old and worked in commercial real estate in the western suburbs of Chicago. He was charming in the way that men in his industry are trained to be. Good handshake, remembered names, knew when to laugh at a joke and when to be serious. He was 6 feet tall with dark hair that had gone distinguished gray at the temples, and when he walked into a room, people noticed him. When I married him in a rented vineyard outside of Galena, Illinois, 9 years ago, I thought I was marrying a man who was, fundamentally, good. I was wrong about the fundamentally part. But it took me a long time to understand exactly where the goodness ended and where the performance began. Diane Hutchins was 67 years old and lived 20 minutes from our house in a colonial in Wheaton she had never once offered to leave. She had been widowed when Marcus was 19 and had spent the following 25 years cultivating a relationship with her son that I can only describe as architecturally designed. She did not interfere, obviously. She never showed up unannounced with food or opinions stated plainly. She worked through inference, through suggestion, through letters tucked into drawers and phone calls made at 7 in the morning before I was awake. She had never liked me. I had known that from the first Thanksgiving. What I had underestimated, and this is the part I will not forgive myself for underestimating, was how willing Marcus was to be guided by her. To understand how far back this went, I have to go back to the beginning. Not to the wedding, not to the first year of the marriage when things were still good enough to be worth keeping. I have to go back to the night before we got engaged, when Marcus and I sat at the kitchen table of the apartment we shared in Lincoln Park, and I told him I intended to keep my finances separate after we married. I wasn't asking permission. I had a business I had built from nothing, a savings account I had funded through 10 years of disciplined work, and a retirement account I had opened at 23 because my own mother had taught me that financial independence was not optional for a woman. I said this plainly. Marcus said he understood. He said he respected it. He kissed my forehead and told me I was the most capable person he had ever met. What I didn't know was that he called Diane that same night. I found this out 5 years later from Marcus's cousin Derek, who had overheard the conversation at a family gathering, and who was, by the time he told me, sufficiently disenchanted with the Hutchins family mythology to say it plainly. Marcus had called his mother and told her I was keeping my accounts separate, and she had said, and Derek remembered this clearly because he had found it so strange. She had said, "Then you'll need to find another way in." Another way in. As if my life were a property he was trying to acquire. The early years of our marriage looked fine from the outside. We lived in a 4-bedroom house in Naperville that we had purchased jointly. 1,900 square feet, good school district, a backyard I planted with a garden that became the only part of that property I ever truly loved. Marcus was good at the performance of the marriage. He was attentive at dinner parties. He remembered anniversaries. He bought thoughtful gifts and showed up to events I hosted with his tie straightened and his best handshake ready. We did not have children, which was a source of grief for both of us for the first few years, and eventually became simply a fact of our lives. What was happening beneath that surface was a slow, methodical, and carefully orchestrated erosion. It did not happen all at once. It happened the way water shapes stone, not dramatically, but constantly, and always in the same direction. The direction was away from me. The first financial irregularity I noticed was in year 3 of the marriage. Marcus had suggested we open a joint account for household expenses, utilities, groceries, home maintenance, that kind of thing. I agreed. I thought it was reasonable. We each contributed $2,000 a month into that account and used it for shared expenses. What I noticed in year 3 was that the withdrawals from that account did not consistently match the expenses of the household. There were cash withdrawals on Saturdays, not large ones, $300 here, $200 there. When I asked Marcus about them, he said it was for miscellaneous stuff, dry cleaning, tips, small things. I looked at him and I thought, that's not how cash works for dry cleaning. But I said okay, and I noted it in my personal records with the date and the amount. Diane had been involved in the joint account conversation. Not directly. She wasn't in the room. But I know now, because Marcus told me later in an argument where he said more than he intended to, that she had advised him to set up the joint account specifically because it would give him visibility into my spending patterns and create a point of financial dependency I might eventually rely on. She had told him to be patient, that I would soften over time. I did not soften, but I did learn to be quieter about what I was observing. The cash withdrawals continued for years. The amount stayed small enough to be explainable and large enough in aggregate to matter. Over 6 years, I calculated later with the help of my colleague and friend Patricia that Marcus had withdrawn approximately $47,000 in cash from our joint account in amounts that were not supported by any documented household expense. $47,000 in cash. Gone. The Saturday absences began in year 4. Marcus started spending Saturday mornings away from the house, first occasionally, then regularly, then with such consistency that I could set a clock by it. He said he was playing golf with colleagues. He said he was meeting clients for breakfast. He said he was going to his mother's house to help with yard work. I drove past Diane's house one Sunday afternoon, and her yard was immaculate, and her lawn service truck was in the driveway. Marcus had not been to his mother's house to do yard work. He had been going somewhere else. I did not confront him. I was watching, and I was learning. There was a Saturday in October of year 6 that I want to describe in detail, because it was the day I understood the full scope of what I had stayed home with what I told Marcus was a migraine. He left at 10:45 in the morning with a golf bag in the back of his car. And I want to be precise because precision matters. I had checked the golf bag the evening before and removed the rangefinder he always clipped to the bag. When he came home at 4:30, the rangefinder was still gone. He had not used it because he had not been at a golf course. He came into the bedroom where I was lying down and asked how I was feeling, and I said, "Better, thanks." And I looked at his shoes. They were clean. Men who spend 4 hours walking a golf course in October do not come home with clean shoes. I wrote it down. Date, October 14th. Time of departure, 10:45. Time of return, 4:32. Shoes, clean. Golf bag, rangefinder missing. I did not say anything. I never said anything before I was ready. The truly stunning thing about Diane's involvement was how seamlessly she integrated herself into the cover. She was the person who, when I called looking for Marcus on a Saturday, he had said he'd be with her, answered the phone with no hesitation and said, "Oh yes, he just stepped out for a moment. Want me to have him call you?" She said it smoothly, warmly, as if she had been doing it for years, because she had been. When I checked Marcus's phone location that same Saturday, and I'm going to be precise here, because precision is what I do, he was at an address in Oak Brook that I did not recognize. I looked up the address. It was a condominium building. I wrote that down too. By year 6, I had a private file on my work laptop that was password protected and cloud-backed, and contained 2 years of documented irregularities, cash withdrawal records, dates, and amounts. Location data from the shared family account we used for phone plans. Marcus had never thought to disable location sharing. Photographs of Diane's letter when I found it, and 3 other notes I had found in the preceding 18 months, that I had quietly photographed and replaced exactly as I found them. A list of the Oakbrook address visits with dates and times, compiled from the location data, and a growing unease about a business entity Marcus had incorporated 2 years prior that I had known about because he had mentioned it over dinner, and then never mentioned again. The business entity was called Lakefront Commercial Advisory, LLC. Marcus had told me it was a passive investment vehicle he had set up with a colleague. I had nodded and asked a few questions, and he had given me vague answers and changed the subject. What he did not know, what he had apparently not considered, was that I am a forensic accountant who had spent 16 years following money through corporate structures for a living. I pulled the Illinois Secretary of State records one afternoon from my office computer. Lakefront Commercial Advisory LLC had been incorporated 31 months ago. Marcus was listed as a registered agent. The second registered agent was a woman named Vanessa Cole. I looked up Vanessa Cole. She was 36 years old, a licensed real estate agent working out of the Oakbrook area. Her business address was the condominium building Marcus had been visiting on Saturdays for at least the past 22 months. I sat in my office chair and I looked at the screen for a long time. Not because I was surprised. I was not surprised. I was calibrating. I was thinking about what I still needed before I was ready to move. I want to tell you about a dinner party we attended in November of that year, because it illustrates something important about the dual performance Marcus and Diane had been running. It was at the home of Marcus's colleague Drew and his wife Tamara, who had been friends of ours, or of Marcus's, or of the married version of us, for years. Diane was there because she was often included in this social circle, a fact I had found increasingly strange as the years passed, and which I now understood was strategic. Her presence normalized the dynamic, made it look like a warm, extended family rather than a surveillance structure. At dinner, Diane spoke about our marriage with obvious pride. She said Marcus had really found his partner in me. She said she was grateful for how I had supported his career. She squeezed my hand across the table when she said it, and I felt the warmth of her palm and thought about the letter in the hallway drawer, and kept my expression pleasant and unchanged. That is what 9 years of a marriage with sustained deception does to a person. It makes them very good at maintaining a neutral expression while doing significant internal calculation. I called Patricia that evening from the parking lot before we drove home. Patricia Osei had been my closest professional colleague for 8 years. She was a CPA who specialized in divorce financial analysis, which is exactly as useful as it sounds, and she was one of exactly 2 people in my life who knew the full picture. The other was my attorney, whom I had first consulted 14 months earlier. I had not said a word to Marcus. I had not said a word to Diane. I had been building quietly, in a direction they could not see. Patricia said, "Okay, so what do we do first?" We started with the business entity. Patricia knew a forensic investigator named Howard Barker, who specialized in undisclosed marital assets, and Howard spent 3 weeks pulling every thread attached to Lakefront Commercial Advisory LLC. What he found was this. The LLC had been used to receive real estate commissions that Marcus had redirected through Vanessa Cole's agency license. Marcus did not have a real estate license. Vanessa did. When Marcus brought buyers or sellers to deals, something he did regularly in his commercial real estate work, the commissions were legally processed through a licensed agent. In a legitimate arrangement, those commissions would have been disclosed income. In this arrangement, they were flowing into the LLC, which Marcus controlled, and from the LLC, they were moving into a personal savings account at a bank I had no knowledge of and therefore no access to. Howard found $83,000 that had passed through this structure over 26 months. $83,000 in income Marcus had earned through our marital years that he had deliberately routed away from disclosure. That is not a mistake. That is not careless bookkeeping. That is financial fraud conducted within a marriage, against a spouse who was, coincidentally, a forensic accountant. The irony was not lost on me, and I mention it because it tells you something important about how thoroughly Marcus had underestimated me. At this point, I want to stop and address something directly because I think it matters. I was not preparing this information to use as a weapon. I was not compiling it out of spite. I was doing what I had been trained to do when I encountered evidence of financial misconduct. I was documenting it carefully, verifying it thoroughly, and preparing to present it properly. Every piece of paper I collected was collected legally. Every record I accessed was one I was legally entitled to access. Every consultation I had was conducted in confidence with licensed professionals. I was not improvising. I was working a case, and the case happened to be my own marriage. My attorney was Rebecca Cho, whose office was on the 32nd floor of a building on West Monroe Street in downtown Chicago. Rebecca was 52 years old, 5'4", and wore reading glasses she pushed up onto her head when she was thinking through a problem. She had represented clients in divorce proceedings for 21 years, and she told me, at our first meeting 14 months before the divorce was filed, that I was the most prepared client she had encountered in more than a decade of practice. I had brought a folder. The folder had tabs. The tabs were labeled chronologically and cross-referenced by category. Rebecca looked at the folder and said, "I think we're going to be fine." I said, "I'm not ready yet. I need more." She said, "Tell me what you're looking for." I told her about the LLC, about the cash withdrawals, about the location data, about the pattern of Saturday absences and the clean shoes in October, and the note in Diane's handwriting about finding another way in. Rebecca listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "Give me 60 days. I want Howard on the LLC before we move." I gave her 60 days. Then I gave her another 30. Then I waited for the right moment, and the right moment came on a Sunday evening in March, when Diane spread her leather portfolio on my dining room table and told me that real families put their finances together. Now I have to tell you about that dinner, because it is the moment this story turns, and because it is the moment Diane made the mistake that accelerated everything. It was a Sunday in March, approximately 6 weeks after I had found the letter in the hallway drawer. Diane had invited herself to dinner under the guise of helping Marcus with some paperwork related to her estate planning. She had been doing this with increasing frequency, arriving with purpose, staying for hours, inserting herself into the domestic rhythm of our house in a way that felt less like visits and more like installations. I had learned to cook more than I needed when she was coming, and to say very little during dinner. After dinner, while I was clearing the table, Diane opened her leather portfolio, the kind with the gold clasp that she carried to every meeting, whether it was necessary or not, and she laid a set of papers on the table. She said, "I've had Gerald look over a few things, and I think the three of us should talk about your financial setup." I set the dishes down and sat back down at the table. Marcus was watching me with an expression I had learned to read. It was the expression of a man who knows something is coming and has decided to let someone else start it. Diane said it was about security. She said that in a real marriage, in a strong marriage, both partners needed to be fully invested. She said that keeping separate finances was a sign of holding back, of not being fully committed to the partnership. She looked at my documents. She had asked to see the deed on our house the previous week under the pretense of reviewing estate matters, and I had provided a copy. And she said that she thought I should consider transferring my savings into a joint account with Marcus. She said, "That's how real families work, Claire. That's how you know you're building something together." I looked at her. I looked at Marcus. And I smiled softly, and I nodded. I said, "You know, that's an interesting perspective, Diane. I actually have some paperwork of my own I'd like to go over." I got up from the table and I went to my home office. I came back with a folder, not the main documentation file, not the full case I was building, but a subset, a carefully chosen subset. I set it on the table between them. I said, "I've been doing some financial review of my own. I want to make sure we're all on the same page about what we're actually working with." The first document I laid on the table was a summary of the joint account cash withdrawals, $47,000 over 6 years. Dated, categorized, and cross-referenced against documented household expenses. Marcus looked at it. His color changed in a way that was almost interesting to observe. The second document was a printout of the Illinois Secretary of State filing for Lakefront Commercial Advisory, LLC, with the registered agents highlighted. Vanessa Cole's name was in yellow. The third document was a one-page summary Howard had prepared, sanitized for this presentation, without the full forensic detail, showing the $83,000 in undisclosed income routed through the LLC structure. Diane was very still. Marcus pushed back from the table. He said, "Where did you get this?" I said, "I'm a forensic accountant, Marcus. This is what I do." He said, "And I want to record this exactly because it is the sentence that told me everything I needed to know about how little he had been paying attention for 9 years. Why didn't I know this?" I looked at him for a long moment. There was no anger in my voice when I answered, There was no trembling. I said, "That's a good question." Then I picked up my folder and I went back to my home office, and I closed the door and I called Rebecca Cho. I said, "I'm ready." She said, "I'll file Monday morning." I want to be precise about what happened in the following 72 hours because precision is what I do and because the details matter. Monday morning, Rebecca filed for divorce in DuPage County Circuit Court. The filing cited financial fraud and irreconcilable differences. The petition included preliminary documentation of the undisclosed LLC income and requested immediate discovery into Marcus's full financial holdings, all accounts, all entities, all assets held individually or jointly. Because Rebecca had been advising me for over a year, the filing was exceptionally detailed. The judge assigned to the case ordered a financial restraining order, which meant that neither party could move, hide, or dispose of marital assets pending the proceedings. This was critical, because Marcus's first instinct when facing exposure was almost certainly to move money. He was too late. The restraining order was in place by Monday afternoon. Tuesday morning, I arrived at my office at 7:30, which is my normal time. I did not call in sick. I did not take a personal day. I sent Marcus a text through my attorney's recommended communication channel, a documented thread, informing him that I would be staying at a hotel for the week to allow space for both of us, and that all further communication should go through Rebecca's office. He called 4 times. I did not answer. He texted 17 times in a 12-hour window. I did not respond. He drove to my office building and sat in the parking garage for 40 minutes. I know this because the parking garage has cameras and a security officer I have known for years mentioned it to me. I did not go down. Wednesday morning, Diane called me. This is the part I want to talk about carefully, because Diane's call was not what I expected, and I had prepared for a great many possibilities. Diane was calm. She was not apologetic. She was not frightened. She spoke to me with the controlled register of a woman who believes she still has options. And she told me that what I had done, filing for divorce without giving Marcus the opportunity to explain, was impulsive and that I would regret it. She said she had known from the beginning that I was not right for her son. She said I had always been more interested in my career than in building a family. She said that Marcus had told her I was distant, that I was cold, that I had never fully invested in the marriage. I let her finish. I had my phone on speaker, and I was taking notes with the date and time stamped on my digital notepad. When she was done, I said, "Diane, I want to let you know that this call is being documented per my attorney's advice. I'd recommend you speak to your own counsel before contacting me again." Then I ended the call. What Diane did not know was that she had already been identified in our divorce proceeding as a material witness. The letter I had found in the hallway drawer in February, the letter I had photographed, replaced, and preserved, was already in Rebecca's file. It documented Diane's explicit advisory role in Marcus's financial strategy regarding my assets. It documented her encouragement to find another way into my finances. It documented her ongoing coaching of her son in how to manage and ultimately undermine my financial independence within our marriage. That letter, combined with Gerald the financial advisor's connection to the matter, was enough for Rebecca to issue a formal witness notice to Diane requiring her cooperation with the discovery process. Diane's attorney called Rebecca's office the following Monday. Now let me tell you what the full discovery process revealed, because the complete picture was significantly larger than what I had originally documented, and I had originally documented quite a lot. The financial discovery process in our divorce lasted 4 months. Patricia worked alongside Howard and 2 additional forensic specialists retained by Rebecca's firm. What they found, account by account and entity by entity, was this. The Lakefront Commercial Advisory LLC had received not $83,000, as Howard's initial report had estimated, but $112,000 over its full operating history. The additional $29,000 had been moved into the LLC in the final 6 months, the period during which Marcus had apparently begun to suspect that something was shifting in our household. He had accelerated the transfers. He had also opened a second business entity in Wisconsin, a state with different disclosure requirements, which Howard identified through a cross-state commercial registry search. That entity, called Meridian Properties Consulting LLC, had received $46,000 in transfers from the first LLC in the preceding 8 months. $158,000 in total, moved through a structure designed to obscure it from marital asset disclosure. That is not a rounding error. That is a deliberate financial architecture built specifically to deprive me of my legal entitlement to marital assets. Rebecca filed an amended petition with the additional documentation. The judge's expression, as Rebecca later described it to me at our next meeting, was not sympathetic to Marcus. The cash withdrawals from the joint account, $47,000 over 6 years, which I had already documented, were now formally part of the record. Marcus's attorney attempted to argue that the withdrawals were for legitimate household expenses that simply hadn't been itemized. Rebecca presented my documentation. Every household expense for our marriage, categorized, dated, and cross-referenced. The unexplained cash withdrawals had no corresponding household expense. They were simply gone. The Saturday visits to Vanessa Cole's condominium in Oak Brook were documented through location data, which Marcus's attorney attempted to argue was obtained improperly. Rebecca and her team had obtained the location data through our shared phone plan, to which I was a co-account holder and therefore had legal access. The court agreed. What the location data showed was that Marcus had visited that address on 47 separate Saturdays over the preceding 23 months. 47 visits. That is not a business relationship. That is a parallel life, maintained with extraordinary regularity while I was in our garden in Naperville pulling weeds from around the tomato plants. There were 2 additional discoveries I want to describe because they were significant in ways I had not anticipated. The first was a life insurance policy. Howard found a whole life insurance policy Marcus had taken out 18 months prior, with a death benefit of $300,000, naming Vanessa Cole as the sole beneficiary. Marcus had paid the premiums from a personal credit card I had not known existed. The credit card had been opened 4 years into our marriage, and its statements, when subpoenaed, showed consistent monthly charges at the Oak Brook address: restaurants, grocery stores, a subscription to a streaming service. The ordinary financial debris of a domestic life being funded by marital income without marital disclosure. The second was a property. Howard identified a condominium unit in Waukegan, Illinois, that had been purchased 26 months ago in the name of Meridian Properties Consulting, LLC, the Wisconsin entity. The property had been bought for $184,000 and was currently leased to a tenant at $1,500 per month. The funds used for the purchase had flowed through a sequence of transfers that began in the Lakefront LLC and terminated in a title company that did not appear connected to Marcus until you followed the chain, which Howard did, and which took him 11 days of documentation to unravel. Marcus had purchased an investment property with marital funds, titled it in a shell entity, leased it for income, and told me nothing about any of it. That property became part of the marital estate the moment it was documented. The tenant continued paying rent into an account that was now under court observation. Not a dollar of it was going anywhere Marcus could reach. Vanessa Cole received a subpoena as part of the civil fraud proceeding that Rebecca filed separately from the divorce. The civil suit named Marcus and Lakefront Commercial Advisory, LLC as defendants in a claim for fraudulent concealment of marital assets and conversion of marital funds. Vanessa, as a registered agent and participant in the LLC structure, was named as a material witness, and potentially a co-defendant depending on the investigation's conclusions. I want to pause here and say something about Vanessa, because she is a real person who made real choices, and I want to be precise about what those choices were. Vanessa Cole knew Marcus was married. She told the attorney's investigator in a recorded interview that she had known from the beginning. She said Marcus had told her I was emotionally unavailable and that we were essentially separated. She said she had believed this because she had wanted to believe it. She said she had thought the LLC was a legitimate business arrangement because she had wanted to think that too. She said a great many things that amounted to the same basic conclusion. She had taken the version of the story that was convenient for her, and she had built her life around it for almost 2 years. I do not have sympathy for this. I have understanding of it, in the abstract way that I understand most human behavior. But understanding is not the same as absolution, and Vanessa had looked at the structure of that LLC, had watched the money flow through it, had deposited commission payments into accounts she knew were not being disclosed, and had chosen, each time, to continue. That is not a mistake. That is a sustained pattern of choices, and sustained choices have sustained consequences. The civil fraud proceeding ultimately resulted in a negotiated settlement. Marcus agreed to a judgment of $210,000, which combined the LLC funds, the cash withdrawals, and damages to avoid a trial that would have been significantly more damaging to his professional reputation. Vanessa settled separately for a judgment that required her to cooperate fully with documentation and forego any future claim to assets derived from the LLC structure or the Waukegan property. Her real estate license was reviewed by the Illinois Department of Financial and Professional Regulation following a complaint filed as part of the proceedings. The review resulted in a 6-month suspension and a formal notation on her license record. I am going to say something true, which is that I took no pleasure in the license suspension. I did not engineer it. The regulatory complaint was a required procedural consequence of the documented use of a licensed professional's credentials in a financial scheme. The consequences followed from the facts, not from my feelings. My feelings, by the time the suspension was announced, were somewhere between neutral and entirely focused on the next chapter of my own life. Let me also tell you about the mediation session, because it is the place where I said the sentence I had been carrying for 14 months. The mediation was held on a Thursday morning in the offices of a neutral mediator named Charles Webb, on the 12th floor of a building in Downers Grove. Rebecca was there. Marcus's attorney, a man named Peterson, was there. Marcus was there. He was wearing a gray suit I had bought him for his 43rd birthday. He looked diminished in it in a way I had not anticipated, and did not particularly register emotionally. Peterson began by proposing a settlement framework that treated the marriage as a standard no-fault dissolution and distributed assets on a 50-50 basis, excluding the LLC findings as what he called accounting ambiguities. Rebecca looked at him with the patience of a woman who had been practicing law for 21 years and said, "Those accounting ambiguities are $158,000 in documented undisclosed marital funds, a $300,000 insurance policy benefiting a third party, and a property in Waukegan we can trace to marital income through 11 months of forensic accounting." She set a binder on the table. The binder was 4 inches thick. She said, "Would your client like to continue treating these as ambiguities?" Marcus looked at the binder. He looked at me. He had not looked at me directly since the evening at the dining room table when I set the folder down in front of him and Diane. In the weeks since the filing, all communication had gone through attorneys. In mediation, there was no buffer. He looked at me across the table, and his expression was something I had not seen on his face before in 9 years of marriage. Genuine reckoning. Not remorse, necessarily. Not even apology. Just the specific recognition of a man who understands, perhaps for the first time, that the person across from him had been watching more carefully than he knew. I said to him quietly, and without inflection, "I have been a forensic accountant since before I met you. I have always known what I was looking at." He didn't answer. He looked away. That was the sentence I had been carrying. I did not shout it. I did not build to it. I said it the way you state a professional finding, factually, with precision, and then I was done with it. The settlement was reached 4 hours later. The divorce was finalized 11 months after I filed. Let me be precise about the settlement because precision is what I do, and because I think it matters for you to understand what accountability actually looks like when the preparation has been thorough. Marcus received the commercial real estate business and its associated professional relationships. He received approximately 40% of our joint assets, a reduction from the presumptive 50% that reflected the fraudulent concealment of marital funds, which the court treated as waste of marital assets. He received the investment account he had maintained individually throughout our marriage. He did not receive our house. He did not receive my retirement account or my professional business. He did not receive any portion of the income I had earned independently during the marriage. He received approximately $220,000 in total assets, net of the civil judgment. I received the house in Naperville, which I promptly sold for $610,000 in a market that had been generous to our neighborhood. I received 60% of all documented joint assets. I received the full judgment from the civil fraud proceeding, which was paid from Marcus's business accounts and individual savings over an 18-month payment schedule with interest. I received my professional business at full value, including client relationships I had built before the marriage and maintained throughout it. I received my retirement account, which I had been funding since I was 23. I received, in total, a settlement that Rebecca described as one of the more complete outcomes she had seen in a case of this complexity. I also received the Waukegan property as part of the marital estate distribution. I sold it 14 months later for $211,000. The tenants stayed through the sale. I thanked them in writing and wished them well with the new owners. They had done nothing wrong. Not everyone in this story had. What Marcus received was proportional. What he lost was permanent. And what about Diane? Diane's role as a material witness in the proceedings required her to submit to a full deposition. Her attorney was present. Rebecca was present. It lasted 4 hours. In the deposition, Diane confirmed the letter. She could not deny it. I had the original photograph and she knew I had it. She confirmed that she had spoken to Marcus about my finances on multiple occasions. She confirmed that she had introduced Marcus to Gerald specifically to discuss strategies for addressing what she called my financial resistance to full partnership in the marriage. She confirmed that she had covered for Marcus on at least 6 specific occasions when I had called looking for him, directing me away from questions she did not want me asking. The deposition transcript is a matter of public record. I am not going to quote it at length. What I will tell you is that several people who had known Diane in the Wheaton community for years read the coverage of the case in the local legal notices and found their understanding of her materially altered. The church committee she had chaired for 6 years asked her to step down from her position, citing concerns about her conduct. 2 longtime friends stopped returning her calls. Her sister in Cincinnati, a woman named Elaine who I had always liked enormously, and who had told me at my wedding that she was glad Marcus had found me, sent Diane a letter. I do not know what was in that letter. I know Diane did not speak to Elaine for 7 months afterward. Gerald, the financial advisor who had reviewed my documents and advised Diane on how to approach the joint account conversation, was referred to the Illinois Department of Financial and Professional Regulation for a conduct review regarding his participation in discussions about another individual's private financial holdings without that individual's knowledge or consent. The review was ongoing as of the time this story was finalized. Diane did not lose her house. She did not lose her income. What she lost was the reputation she had spent decades constructing, the image of the wise, devoted mother who had raised her son well and guided him with good values. The deposition transcript made clear what had actually been guiding. What had actually been guiding was self-interest, dressed in the language of family values. She called me once after the divorce was finalized. I did not answer. She left a voicemail. I listened to it once, noted the date and time in my records out of habit, and deleted it. There was nothing in it I needed. I sold the house in Naperville in the fall. I moved to a 1-bedroom apartment in the West Loop neighborhood of Chicago, 840 square feet, all mine, on the 6th floor of a building with a roof deck from which I could see the city in 4 directions. I had not lived alone in 9 years. The first night in that apartment, I ordered Thai food, ate it sitting on the kitchen floor because my furniture hadn't arrived yet, and felt a quiet that I had forgotten was a form of pleasure. I want to describe that apartment accurately because accuracy is how I show things are real. The kitchen had white subway tile and south-facing windows that filled the room with light by 9 in the morning. The morning light came in at an angle that caught the steam from my coffee cup and turned it golden. My bedroom had enough space for my bed and a reading chair and a lamp and not much else, and it was the best room I had ever slept in. My home office was a corner of the living room with a desk I had chosen myself, a plant I bought at the farmer's market on a Sunday morning, a fiddle-leaf fig that I fully expected to kill and somehow did not, and a view of the street below where people walked their dogs before work with their coats not quite buttoned against the March cold. Patricia had coffee with me the first week I moved in. We sat at my kitchen table with the south light coming in, and she said, "How do you feel?" I said, "I feel like myself." She laughed and said, "Good, because I've missed her." I laughed too. Actually laughed, without calculating whether it was appropriate or whether someone nearby would use it against me. I had not laughed without calculation in longer than I could clearly remember. That itself was information I filed away, not with grief, but with the specific satisfaction of a person who has identified the source of a problem and removed it. In the months after the divorce, I returned to things I had set aside during the marriage. I had been a serious runner before I met Marcus. Half marathons, training schedules, the specific discipline of covering distance 1 mile at a time. I had mostly stopped during the marriage because my weekends had been organized around the performance of being a married woman in a suburban community, and there had not been much room for the self I was before. I bought new shoes and started again. The first run was humbling. 2 miles at a pace I would have been embarrassed by 8 years earlier. The 10th was better. By spring, I was running along the Riverwalk before work in the dark, watching the city come on light by light above the water, and feeling every morning like a person who remembered what her own body was capable of. My professional practice grew in the year following the divorce. I took on 2 new corporate clients I had been hesitant to pursue during the marriage, not for any rational reason, but because the energy of living in a situation of sustained vigilance leaves very little room for expansion. When that energy was redirected into my actual work, the results were measurable. I hired a junior analyst named Kenji, who was 28 years old and extraordinarily precise, and who referred to me as the most organized person he had ever met, which I took as the highest possible compliment. By the end of the year following my divorce, my practice revenue had increased by 31%. I thought about Marcus in those months, with a regularity that decreased steadily and without drama. Not with longing, not with anger. Mostly with the mild interest one feels toward a case that has been closed and filed. Occasional reference, but no longer the organizing principle of my professional attention. He had lost several major commercial real estate clients within 18 months of the divorce finalization. The financial strain of the settlement, combined with the professional damage of having his concealment strategy documented and publicly associated with his name in court records, had cost him work he had not been able to replace. He was operating out of a smaller office in Schaumburg. He was, by all accounts I received through professional channels, managing. I do not track him. I do not need to. The case is closed. I want to tell you about something that happened 3 months after the divorce was finalized, because I think it is part of the story, and because I think it illustrates something important about the kind of clarity you develop when you have been forced to live with sustained deception and finally step out of it. I was at a professional conference in downtown Chicago, a forensic accounting and financial litigation conference I had attended every year for a decade. It was held at the Marriott on Michigan Avenue, which Marcus and I had stayed at once on our second anniversary, a fact I registered, and then set down the way you set down a coffee cup you no longer need. I was there for the full 2 days. I presented a paper on detection methodologies for corporate asset concealment on the second morning. Afterward, a woman came up to me at the coffee table. She was 44 years old, she told me, worked in internal audit, had 2 kids in middle school, and a husband she described as, and I am quoting, someone whose finances I am not entirely sure I understand anymore. She did not say it as a joke. She said it the way people say things they have been carrying, quietly, with a studied casualness that is doing a great deal of work. I looked at her for a moment. I said, "What specifically are you not sure about?" She blinked. She had expected me to say something reassuring. To say, "Oh, I'm sure it's fine," or "marriages always have some financial complexity." She had not expected the question. She said, "He has a business account I don't have access to. He said it's for tax purposes." I said, "How long has he had it?" She said, 3 years, I think. Maybe 4. I handed her my business card. I said, "Call me this week if you want to. You came here today because you already know something. Don't wait until you know everything to start documenting what you have." She took the card. She called me 4 days later. I referred her to Rebecca's office. I do not know how her situation resolved, and it would not be appropriate for me to say even if I did. But I know she called. And I know that the moment she picked up the phone, something had shifted from suspicion to action. That shift is everything. I think about that woman sometimes when I am running in the mornings. I do not know her name. I know only that she recognized something in a conference room over bad hotel coffee and decided to ask the next question instead of suppressing it. Every case begins with someone deciding to ask the next question. Now let me tell you about the first Thanksgiving after the divorce, because I think it is part of what recovery actually looks like. Not the dramatic parts, but the ordinary ones. I had spent every Thanksgiving of my marriage at Diane's house in Wheaton. 8 Thanksgivings in 9 years. 1 year Marcus and I had traveled to Portugal in November, which was the best Thanksgiving of my marriage, and which I now understand was partly enjoyable because Diane was not present. The Wheaton Thanksgivings were performances. Diane made the turkey and the stuffing and told stories about Marcus as a child and his late father and the family's history, and I sat at the table and participated in the performance and came home exhausted in a way that I had learned to call holiday fatigue. The first Thanksgiving after the divorce, I drove to Columbus to see Joanna. She has a house in Clintonville with a small dining room and a big kitchen and a dog named Biscuit, who is approximately 12 years old and has strong opinions about where people sit. I made sweet potato casserole and a cranberry sauce from scratch, and Joanna made everything else. And we ate at the table in the dining room, with Biscuit at our feet, and Joanna's neighbor Carol, who is 73 and brings a bottle of good wine and strong feelings about the parade. We ate at 2 in the afternoon, and it took about 40 minutes. And afterward, we sat in the living room and watched old movies, and I fell asleep on the couch around 7 and woke up at 9 to find a blanket had been put over me, and the dog was at my feet and the house smelled like pie. That is what recovery looks like. Not dramatic, not triumphant in the cinematic sense, just a blanket and a dog and the particular piece of a house where no one is performing anything. I drove back to Chicago the next morning in the gray November light, and I thought about the 9 Thanksgivings at Diane's table, and I thought about the 47 Saturday absences, and the $158,000, and the letter in the hallway drawer. And none of it had the weight it once had. It had the weight of history, of facts in a closed file. It had happened. It was done. And I was driving north on 71 toward a city where I had an apartment and a plant and a practice and a morning running route, and none of it required anyone's permission or concealment or management. That is not a small thing. I want to be clear about that. The ordinary piece of that drive, the gray light and the highway and the coffee in the cup holder going cold because I kept forgetting to drink it, that piece was bought at a specific price, and the price was worth every cent. Vanessa Cole had, as of the last information I received from Howard's final report, suspended her real estate practice during the license review and had not resumed it following the reinstatement. She had relocated from the Oakbrook condominium, which she had apparently been renting, not owning, a detail I found instructive, to a different zip code entirely. The relationship with Marcus, which had apparently been the premise of significant life decisions on her part, had not survived the disclosure of what that relationship had actually been. Marcus had told her, apparently, that he had been on the verge of leaving me for years. He had told her they would build something real. He had told her a great many things that turned out to be the same kind of architecture he had built his financial life around, plausible on the surface, hollow underneath, and designed to benefit the person doing the telling. She had wanted to believe it. That is a choice. Choices have consequences. Hers were proportional. I want to say something about what I learned, because I think it matters, and because I think some of what I learned is less obvious than it might appear. The first thing I learned is that what you know is not less real because someone tells you you don't know it. I had been watching Marcus for years. I had been filing information away, noting irregularities, tracking patterns. At several points during that process, I had wondered whether I was being paranoid, whether I was being the difficult, resistant, insufficiently committed woman that Diane had described in her letter. The training of the marriage, of his deflections, of Diane's quiet campaigns, of the endless subtle pressure to be more agreeable and less analytical, had worked on me to some degree. I had been slower to trust my own professional instincts than I would have been in a client situation. That is the work of sustained gaslighting. It does not eliminate your perception. It teaches you to doubt it. But the perception does not go away. It waits. And when you stop doubting it and start feeding it with documentation, it becomes irrefutable. The second thing I learned is that documentation is not vindictiveness. It is protection. Every record I kept, every photograph I took, every date and amount I noted in my private file, these were not acts of aggression. They were acts of professional self-preservation by a woman who could see what was happening and understood that seeing alone was not enough. You have to be able to prove what you saw. Evidence is not a weapon. It is the mechanism by which truth survives contact with the people who would prefer it to remain invisible. The third thing I learned is that silence protects the wrong person. I had not told anyone, not Patricia, not Rebecca, not my sister Joanna in Columbus, about the full picture of what was happening until I was well into the documentation phase. I had been protecting the privacy of a marriage that did not deserve my protection. I had been shielding a man who was actively working against my interests because I did not want to make a scene, did not want to be the wife who was not trying hard enough. When I finally spoke, when I finally laid the folder on the table and said, "Here is what I know," the silence I had maintained was instantly revealed for what it had always been: cover for someone who did not deserve it. Silence is a resource. I had been spending mine on the wrong person. The fourth thing I learned, and this is the one I want to say most carefully, is that moving forward and forgiving are not the same thing. I have not forgiven Marcus. I have not forgiven Diane. I am not in the process of forgiving them, and I am not certain I owe that process to either of them or to myself. What I have done is build a life that does not. I think about going to make coffee.